Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Yevamot Daf Kaf Zayin. We're back to complicated Yevamot style daf. I will warn you. One thing I have to say from the beginning, there's one sheet that I kind of put together last night on the presentation that has a mistake. I'll have to fix it after class. So if you want to look at that sheet, I'll kind of skip over it today because it's wrong. But when we get there, you can always look at it later. This morning, I'll have it fixed. Okay, today's daf is dedicated by Natasha Shabbat in memory of Miriam Chaya Bat Raphael, taken from us too soon on March 24th. From St. Paul Academy to Harvard to my many trips back to Minneapolis over the years, I've always looked up to you as a model of Yirat Shamayim and pure love of Hashem. Okay, we're going to get started we should review very quickly yesterday's daf. I don't want to spend too much time, but I'm going to review it very quickly. We had a machloket Rav and Shmuel, and today we're going to have two understandings of Shmuel. Within that, I'll already warn you that not only the two issues of Shmuel, but there's two explanations of Shmuel who disagree with Rav. Rav, actually, there were two also. Rav was what we thought he said, then we changed it to what he actually said. This time, it's actually two different interpretations of Shmuel. Within that, we're going to bring some other thing that Shmuel says in order to get to our first explanation of Shmuel. With that, we're then going to go off on a tangent into those cases, which are two totally different cases. You're going to have to separate them. And then there's also going to be two explanations of Shmuel. So we have two explanations of Shmuel here, and then two explanations of something else Shmuel said. I'm giving this to you from the beginning so that you don't sort of get confused in the blur between them. The easiest way to distinguish the cases is one is relating to a case with tzarot, extra wives, and the other one is not at all, doesn't have any tzarot. So you'll see. The only connection between them is this issue of the chalitza psula, which we started with yesterday, which means a weakened chalitza. Whenever there's no option for yibum, the chalitza is already weaker. So we started with Rav, who was quoted in the name of Rav Bar of Huna, who basically said we had a case of three sisters, right? There's five brothers, three sisters. The three sisters' husbands die. They're each married to three brothers, and they fall to yibum to only two people. Now you have a bit of a problem. How are two people going to do yibum on three sisters? They obviously can't. They can only do chalitza, right? So we explained Rav in the end as saying that what happens is if the first husband died and Reuven did chalitza to the first wife, then Shmuel dies, Shimon does chalitza, the third brother, it's Yehuda dies, Shimon does chalitza to the second wife. Those chalitzas are perfectly good chalitzas because each one only had one sister in front of him at the time. There was no double zika or anything like that, where you have two sisters, right? The whole problem is when you have two sisters with zika. The problem comes in when the third one's husband dies. Yisachar dies. The wife falls to yibum to the two brothers. What's the problem? Achot chalutzato. You're not allowed to do yibum with the woman whose sister you did chalitza with, because remember, chalitza is like as if you were married. So therefore, since you can't marry a woman whose sister you were married to, Rabbi said, you know what? You can't even marry a sister who you did chalitza to because it was as if you had a connection that you had to get rid of. So the third one, what do? Well, first brother does chalitza, but it's not strong enough. So not strong enough to what? And here you have to fill in the blank because we're going to see another case where it's not strong enough for something else. Not strong enough to disconnect her from the other brother. So Shimon also has to do chalitza to that wife. That's the emtzait, even though she's not really the middle, she's the last, but it's kind of the one who ends up with chalitza from both. Shmuel says, no, and then I have to fix one line I explained wrong yesterday. V'ha'amar Rav ein zika, 4 lines from the bottom. Let's just start here. L'divrei ha'omer yesh zika kamar. Didn't Rav say ein zika? And then this whole thing is irrelevant because this is all about zika. So, in other words, originally why we said it had to be one after the other, right? Otherwise, it could have been all three brothers at once. But what do we say? L'divrei ha'omer yesika, and here I explained it wrong. It wasn't those who said Rav held yesika. That's what I said. No. It's Rav said, oh, I don't hold zika, but I'm explaining this case according to those who do hold by zika. Okay, so I'm sorry about that mistake. Shmuel Amar. Now we're starting with Shmuel. Shmuel says, Echad choletz l'kulam, which sounds like, and then we're going to question that in a minute. The way I showed the picture yesterday was Reuven theoretically can. It's not like he has to, but Reuven theoretically can do chalitza to all three sisters. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. That's not going to work according to Shmuel himself because of, and this is where I told you, we're going to quote a different case that Shmuel says entirely, but it has the same principle. The chalitza psula doesn't work. So what's this case? Didn't we hear that Shmuel holds that you need a strong chalitza? In which case, what we're going to say is like this. If you need a strong chalitza, then why is Reuven doing chalitza to all three if we have Shimon who can do a much better chalitza to the second one? Because Reuven's already married to the sister, did chalitza to the sister. The second sister already, when he does chalitza with her, is a weakened chalitza. So why wouldn't we just let Shimon if he can? The third one, we understand you have no option, but why can't we let Shimon do it? The second one. So let's first see where, and then we'll see this all inside. Damar Shmuel, where does he hold that you need a chalitza kshera, like a chalitza ma'alya, meaning a good chalitza? Okay, so Shmuel says, let's say you have Shimon and Levi are married. They're each married to two sisters, Rachel and Leah. Okay, here, right, again, Rachel and Leah are their mothers, really, but in this case, they're going to be their sisters, their wives, I mean. So Leah and Rachel are sisters, and then they each brother, Shimon, is married to another wife. That's why I told you. One case, the first case had no tsarot at all, no extra wives. In this case, there's Bilhah and Zilpah, okay? So Rachel and Bilhah are married to Shimon, and Zilpah and Leah are married to Levi. Now, what happens? They both die. Okay, it doesn't really matter the order or anything right now. They both die. Now, what happens? Reuven, if he does chalitza, chalatz la'achayot, he decides, right, he has a choice. He could do chalitza with Rachel or Bilhah, and he can do chalitza with Leah or Zilpah. If he chooses to do chalitza with the sisters, now we know, because of Zika, he now has two sisters that are connected to each other, right? Meaning, right, he can't marry both of them. He's got Zika of two sisters on him. What do we learn? If a person has Zika of two sisters, he has to do chalitza. So he does chalitza, but since he can't marry them, the chalitza is psula. It's a weakened chalitza. So here we're going to see that Shmuel holds weakened chalitza doesn't work to do what? To exempt the extra wives. So chalatz lachayot lo nifteru tzarot. Bilhah and Zilpah are not exempt, meaning if they want to go marry whoever they want, they have to do chalitza with Reuven. Okay, it's not enough that you do chalitza with one woman and it exempts the other, right? The issue with Rav and Shmuel was, can the chalitza of one disconnect her with the other brother? Here the issue is Reuven has two wives of Shimon he has to deal with, and he has two wives of Levi he has to deal with. Now, normally you do chalitza with one wife, it exempts the other wife. That's just part of Yibum, right? Only one wife has to do Yibum. In this case, since the chalitza is a weak chalitza, he has to do also for Bilhah and Zilpah separately. So he's going to end up having to do chalitza with all four of them. So because he says this, what do you see here? Let's go back to our case. Since Shimon could have done a perfectly good chalitza to that second wife, we're now back to three sisters fall to Yibum to two brothers. Reuven, according to Shmuel, he said, Reuven could do chalitza to all three, but why? The second one is already a chalutzato, it's already a weakened chalitza. Why don't we have Shimon, who hasn't done chalitza to any sisters yet, do the second chalitza? The third one we understand. Okay, fine. Maybe the third one, Reuven, you only need one brother, because that's where he disagrees with Rav. But why would the second one not be just chalitza with Shimon? So chalitza Reuven, chalitza psula. Why would Reuven do a chalitza psula on her? So we're now going to have the first explanation of, okay, and it's really, you could call it the first or the second, but right now we're going to go in order and have two answers to this question. One is to explain Shmuel differently, and the other is to go back to the original explanation we had of Shmuel, okay, and explain it properly. But right now we're going to try a different one. When it says one does chalitza to all, it doesn't mean Reuven does chalitza to all three. What does it mean? Let's go back to our case. Levi died. Reuven does chalitza to his wife, Tamar. Then that's perfectly fine. He doesn't have any other Zika on him, just that one woman. Then Yehuda dies, and we have Shimon. So Shimon is going to do chalitza on Ruth. No problem. That's great. Even Shmuel agrees with that. That's just like Rav. What does he mean? Echad choletz lekulan. When Yisachar dies, Yael is going to do chalitza only with Reuven. She doesn't need chalitza with Shimon, even though it's chalitza psula, right? It's enough to get rid of her Zika with Shimon also. Okay, that's fine. So now, what's the issue here, right? Theoretically, you could say, because at this point, Reuven, right, we're going to see this later. There's a difference between her connection to Reuven and Shimon because Reuven's chalitza is strong enough to get rid of that. It's not enough to get rid of a tzara, like in the other case, but it is enough to get rid of her zika, according to Shmuel. That's where Shmuel disagrees with Rav. He thinks that when it comes to the third one, a chalitza psula is sufficient because Reuven and Shimon are both in the same exact situation. Neither of them can do a perfectly good chalitza. Therefore, one chalitza of one of them is enough for both. So now they're going to question this from the wording of the Mishnah. Veha kulan kamar, but it says, echad choletz the kulan. Kulan sounds like it's talking about all three sisters, and he doesn't do chalitza to all three. So what do they answer? Kevan deruba gabe, kare le kulan. Because Reuven does the majority, he does chalitza with 2 out of 3. So they call it all of them, even though it doesn't really mean all of them. Okay, that's the first answer. The second answer, Ivait Ema. Now, this description and the words on this presentation don't really explain it. The point here is we're going back to the original explanation. The Reuven is actually choletz the kulan, and that's here what the picture shows. Shimon, and again, this isn't what he has to do. It's what he can do if he wants. It's, Reuven, Shimon could also do chalitza to one of them, but if Reuven wants, or Shimon wants for all intents and purposes, they can do chalitza to all 3. It's not a problem. Now, why? Why do we say this is okay if in the other case with the tzarot, Shmuel required a chalitza kshera, perfectly good chalitza? Well, ki ka'amar Shmuel chalitza ma'al yibin, and when he said it, you're comparing 2 different cases. That's lemiftar tzara, hanimile lemiftar tzarata. That was when there was another woman in the picture. In order, and now we're going to distinguish between these 2 things. To get rid of the zika of another tzara, another wife, that you have to go with the stronger chalitza. Okay, you can't do a weak chalitza on one of these sisters who you can't do yibum with. Their chalitza is not going to exempt the tzara. But miftara nafsha patra. But to allow herself, the one who got chalitza, like Yael in our picture, to allow her to go marry anyone she wants, this chalitza is enough to get rid of the zika. You don't need a special extra chalitza of Shimon to get rid of the zika on Yael. Okay, so now we have 2 ways of understanding Shmuel, whether he really meant Reuven can get rid of the zika on all of them by doing chalitza, and you don't really need, right? Even though we said it in the other case with the tzarot, it's not strong enough, but for this, it's strong enough. Or maybe he really meant Reuven does one, Shimon does the other, and the third one just only needs one. Okay, so that's Shmuel. Now we're going to go back to what he said before. Chalatz la'achayot lo niftiru tzarot. Okay, gufa. And now we're going to see that he said a whole slew of things, and we're going to go through them all. Chalatz la'achayot lo niftiru tzarot. So again, we understand that. We have Shimon dies, leaves 2 women, Rachel and Bilhah. Levi dies, leaves Leah and Zilpah. If Reuven does chalitza on Rachel and Leah, since he can't marry them, right? He can't do yibum on them. Therefore, his chalitza is weaker. Therefore, it doesn't exempt Zilpah and Bilhah. He'd have to do chalitza for both. However, the reverse case, chalatz litzarot, if he did Bilhah and Zilpah, then niftiru achayot. That's fine, because that's a perfectly good chalitza for the tzarot. They have no relationship to each other. And therefore, he does a chalitza with Bilhah, he does a chalitza with Zilpah. That gets rid of each of their second wives. Now, here's another case. And here we're going to learn something different entirely, which is, again, all of these have to do with weakened chalitza, but for different reasons. So in this case, it's a much simpler case. We have 2 brothers. Shimon's married to Yael and Shula. We're going back to our regular tzara name. Before there were 2 tzarot, so we just named them Bilhah and Zilpah. Here we just have our Shula character we've seen before. Now, Shimon dies without children. Yael, for some reason, Reuben gives a get to Yael. Now, a get does not get rid of yibum requirement. Get has to do with a marriage. But if he gives her a get, okay, he's already shown that he's disconnecting with her. It has some sort of meaning. Now, it doesn't help with the chalitza. He still has to do chalitza. So let's say he does chalitza with the woman he gave a get to. Lo niftira tzara. Since he already somewhat severed the ties between them, now here's a different kind of reason why a chalitza would not be as strong. Because of that, well, first of all, he can't do yibum with her anymore because he gave her a get, but it's a weaker kind of, he's already somewhat disconnected from her. Okay, so really for 2 reasons, but also he can't do yibum with her because he divorced her, which means he can't marry her anymore because he already forfeited his chance to do yibum by divorcing her. So now that's not strong enough, liftor tatzara. But so now you remember, if he gives her a get, it's not enough. She still needs chalitza. However, so if he gives chalitza, that works for her, but it doesn't help her tzara. But if, okay, so their shul is not exempt. She still has to, he's going to end up doing chalitza to her also. But litzara, but if he decides, I'm going to do chalitza after he gives the divorce document to Yael, he decides I'm going to do chalitza with Shula, well, niftira ba'alat haget, that's a perfectly good chalitza. That will exempt the other woman, okay? Because again, the theory is a perfectly good chalitza is great, okay? So Yael is exempt. Next case, chalatz the ba'alat ha'ma'amar. Remember what ma'amar is? Ma'amar is after Shimon dies without children, Reuben has now 2 wives in front of him. He decides, I'm going to marry, I'm going to do Yibum with Yael, and he does Ma'amar, which is like Kiddushin, okay? So I plan to betroth, right? Basically, it's like a betrothal. He says it in words. It's not exactly a Kiddushin, but it has validity almost like a Kiddushin on a rabbinic level. So now, they're already somewhat married. Now, for Ma'amar, the rabbis instituted, even though it's not really Kiddushin, the rabbis said if you do Ma'amar, and you decide not to marry her, it's not enough to do chalitza. You have to give a get also. So therefore, again, what will logic say? If he decides he's not going to marry her in the end, so he has to do chalitza and a get. So if he does chalitza to her, since she's not fully disconnected from him, that chalitza is not a chalitza kshera, right? It's a chalitza psula. Again, psula doesn't mean invalid. It means it's not a strong one. So if he does chalitza to Yael, lo niftira tzara, Shula is not exempt. Okay, because it's not a strong chalitza. But if, again, going back to the beginning, he does ma'amar with Yael, and then litzara, if he does the chalitza with Shula, niftira ba'alat ma'amar. That's enough to get rid of the chalitza, the zika, the connection to Yael. Now, by the way, she still needs a get, but she doesn't need chalitza. The chalitza covers her. Again, this sounds a little bit long-winded, but it's very simple. If the chalitza is valid and perfectly good and strong, because there's nothing else going on, then it's good to exempt everyone. But if there's something else, like you still need a get, well, your chalitza is not going to exempt the other woman. Okay, so that's where we've gotten to so far. That's Shmuel's statement. Now we're going to start with some questions on Shmuel. Okay, I'm going to start not yet with the pictures. Okay, back to the Gemara. Now we have a very basic question on Shmuel, which is a really good question. Now we're in Shmuel, remember, not in the case of the 3 sisters and who fell to Yibum to 2 brothers. We're now in the case with the tzarot, with the extra wives. And like I said, we're going to have, just like we had 2 explanations of Shmuel in his machloket with Rav about the 3 sisters falling to 2 brothers, we're also going to have 2 explanations of Shmuel about this case of chalatz l'achayot lo nifteru tzarot and l'tzarot lo nifteru achayot. What does this mean? So now they say like this: Ma'ishna la'achayot de lo nifteru tzarot. Why are the achayot not, why is the chalitza not strong enough? Right? Because he has zika of 2 women. And because of the zika, it's not strong, right? He can't marry either one. Remember, the whole theory of chalitza psula is if you can't do yibum, your chalitza is weak. So the achayot, you can't do yibum. Lo nifteru tzarot. Tahavia lo achot isha b'zika. So now they say, chalatz litzarot, which we said would work, shouldn't work either. Lami lo nifteru achayot. Tahavia lehu tzarot achot isha bezika. Remember what we learned. The tzara has the same laws as the woman. So if we basically say that the women themselves are sisters, and if you do chalitza to them, it's not strong enough, they're tzarot, they're basically a tzara to 2 sisters. So they're no different than the sisters themselves. So therefore, they should also, right? You're not allowed to do yibum with them. If you can't do yibum with them, then their chalitza is weak, and then it shouldn't exempt the sisters either. So the second case doesn't make sense either. So now we're going to try an explanation and then kind of question it. Yeah, this is very interesting. I see, I wasn't following the chat because when I share screen, I can't read. I'm assuming that what you're saying is, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I don't know why this didn't come up before. There's a very basic issue that it is strange that it didn't come up before. I don't have a good answer for that. So now we're going to explain. Kasavar Shmuel ein zika. Maybe Shmuel holds there's no zika. And then it's not sarot b'zika. It's just not zika, right? There's no zika. So then they say, wait a minute. V'hamar Shmuel yesh zika, but doesn't he hold there is zika? Just like we answered with Rav, doesn't he hold there isn't zika? And then we said l'divrei ha'omer, l'divrei ha'omer ain't zika kama. Shmuel was saying this halacha according to those who hold there's no zika. Okay, again, a weak explanation, because why would he be giving a law according to people who disagree with it? But that's what they say. So now they say, but wait, if there's no zika, then there's no problem here at all. Which means, right, this was to explain the second part, which worked, that tzarot can exempt the achayot because there's no zika. Well, then the achayot should exempt the tzarot because there's no zika. So, why wouldn't that work? So now he's going to say, Bishlama. Okay, now let's go back to our case. So again, Levi's married to Leah and Zilpah, and Shimon's married to Bilhah and Rachel. I switched it around, okay, before Rachel was on that side, because she's always on the right. But I switched it around because the Gemara is going to use an example of Rachel and have her the second one whose husband dies. Okay, so this is important. That's why I switched the order here. So now, what happens? Bishlamat tzara de Rachel lo tipater. We understand why the tzara of Rachel won't be exempt because, let's see, if Levi dies first, because remember, this is one died after the other. Leah does chalitza with Reuven. Okay, now, then Zilpah, we're now going to say that Zilpah is exempt. Okay, we're now going to say like this. Bishlama, I understand why the tzara of Rachel lo tipater, and we'll explain why in a minute, but tzara de Leah should be exempt because look, when Leah does chalitza with Reuven, Zilpah should totally be exempt. Now, that's not what Shmuel said. Shmuel said, no one's exempt. But I understand why the tzara of Rachel won't be exempt. Why? Because when Shimon dies, right, this isn't an issue of Zika, remember, because we're now explaining that Shimon doesn't hold Zika. When Shimon dies and Rachel falls to Yibum, when he does Yibum with Rachel, right, we understand. Then already it's a chod chalutzato. This has nothing to do with Zika. And that's going to mean that Bilhah is not exempt because it's a weaker chalitza. So, right, therefore, so read it again. The tzara of Rachel, the second one whose husband dies, I understand. Her second wife is not going to be exempt with her chalitza. The kevin the chalitza leLeah, v'hadar chalitza Rachel. Since he did Leah, then he did Rachel. Havile chalitza de Rachel chalitza psula, because she's the sister of a woman that he already did chalitza to, which we already said is not good. Right? He can't do yibum. If he can't do yibum, then the chalitza is no good. But the tzara of Leah should be perfectly fine. So why did you say lo nifteru tzarot? To which the Gemara is going to answer, what does it mean? My lo nifteru tzarot nami tekama atzara de Rachel. We now explain Shmuel that he didn't mean what we thought he meant. When he said chalatz lachayot lo nifteru tzarot, he means just the tzara of the second wife whose husband died, as we just showed. So now the Gemara says, how could you say that? Hatzarot kamar, it says, doesn't exempt the tzarot, right? So tzarot is plural, which seems to be referring to Bilhah and Zilpah. To which the Gemara answers, oh no, it doesn't mean that. It means tzarot alma. It means take 20 cases like this. All the tzarot of the second wife are not exempt, right? Are not exempt. That's like, I'll give you an example where they do this. Arvei psachim. Okay, there's actually a machloket. Is arvei psachim erev or arvei? Or leilei yom kippurim. What does it mean? There's not multiple leilei yom kippurim. What does it mean? It means from year to year. So this means from case to case. If you have many cases like this, all the second tzarot are not exempt. Okay, it's not the greatest explanation, but it's a possible explanation. Again, they're stuck with trying to understand Shmuel. Because if you hold ein zika, then what's the problem? Right? And then the problem is clearly only for the second wife. So now they say, wait a minute. Ve'ihachi, okay, chalatz litzarot nifteru achayot. Okay, here's where I made a mistake in the chart. So I'm not going to show you the chart now, but you can look later today. I'll have it fixed up. If you do chalitza to the tzarot, nifteru achayot, but wait, the tzara of Rachel cannot be exempt. Why is the tzara of Rachel not exempt? Okay, if you go back to the, right, chalatz litzarot nifteru achayot, it won't work. V'hatznan asur adam bitzarat chovat chalutzato. A person is not allowed to do yibum with the tzara of his relative of his chalutza. So let's go through. Leah's the chalutza. He did with Leah first. Right? Oh, sorry. He did the chalatz litzarot. He did the tzara of Leah. Okay, now you can't marry the tzara of the karov of your chalutzato. So now, one second. This This is where I got stuck with my chart, and now I'm stuck again for a second. 1 minute. Right. Basically, we're going to say that Leah, but this is a case where he did with Leah. This is where I'm confused. Right. The point is Rachel's tzara can't be exempt. Why can't Rachel's tzara? Rachel's tzara can't exempt her because she's the tzara of the relative. She's the tzara of the relative of the one who had chalitza. Okay. Now my question is why it's a case of achayot though. When you did this, you did it on the chalutza. So 1 second. Tzara deleati patel. No, I'm still stuck on this. Tzarot ka'amar b'tzarat Rachel shechatza ba'achrona. It seems to be describing a case, I don't know why, where Leah did the chalitza, and then we want to exempt the tzara of Rachel from... So 1 minute, let me just get this straight. Sorry, okay. So again, the tzara of Rachel, why should be exempt? So they're basically saying here that a person can't do yibum with the tzara of her relative. Right. The tricky part here, by the way, in this section is the tzara becomes the opposite. Okay. First, we start with the tzara of Leah, that's Zilpah. Okay. Now, I guess the point is that then Leah, but she's not the chalutza, that's the problem. And now we're going to say the tzara of the karov of the chalutza. So the tzara is Rachel, no, the tzara of Rachel, and Rachel is the krova of the chalutza. It seems to be describing a case. I'm not really sure why they're saying this, though. It seems to be describing a case where Leah did chalitza, and then the tzara of Rachel won't be exempt because she's the, she is the tzara of the relative of the one who did chalitza, and that's also forbidden. I have to figure out what I'm stuck on is why they would be talking about Rachel, Leah doing the chalitza in the first place, and why she's the chalutza, when really it was the relative of, it was her tzara that did it. Okay, I need to leave this aside. I need to come back to this question. I'll explain it tomorrow, God willing. Okay, so now they say because they get to this stuck on the tzara of Rachel still shouldn't be good enough because she's forbidden also to do yibum. If she's forbidden to do yibum, then it's not going to help us, basically. Okay, maybe they are talking about a case. Maybe they're saying if Leah does chalitza and then the tzara does chalitza, that's not going to work either because she's the tzara of the relative of the chalutza. Okay, I'll have to look back into that better. So now, because of that, they're now going to explain Shmuel in a different way. We thought Shmuel meant chalatz l'achayot lo nifteru tzarot, right? He does the two achayot, it doesn't help the tzarot, but if he did the tzarot, he can do the achayot, to which we said, but it has to be ein zika. Well, if you say ein zika, then what's the issue? So then we get stuck here. So now we say, well, Shmuel nami hitchil velo hitchil kama. What Shmuel meant now is, sorry, let me get to this. Why did it turn blue? Okay, now, Shmuel hitchil velo hitchil kama. What does that mean? Instead of saying that he did chalitza to two sisters and then lo nifteru tzarot, or he did chalitza to the two sisters and then it does work. Now we're going to do hitchil velo hitchil. What does that mean? He started with sisters and then went to tzarot, or he started with tzarot and then went to sisters, meaning, right, there's two marriages he has to deal with, two brothers. So we started with one, he did the achot. He started with Leah. Hitchil b'achayot lo yigmor b'tzarot. If he started with Leah, then he can't do bilha. He can't do the tzara of Rachel. Now that's what we just explained, which is why I'm confused why we explained it there before we even had this situation at hand. But basically, Leah is the chalutza, right? That's what we just said. If Leah is his chalutza and her relative is Rachel, he can't do yibum with the tzara of her sister. So that means he can't do yibum with bilha. If he can't do yibum with bilha, then his chalitza is weaker or her chalitza is weaker, which means she can't exempt Rachel. And what did we say? Right? So that's what it means. Lo yigmor b'tzarot, right? Because it won't help if he does bilha, it's not strong enough. Okay, that's what that means. And then, what's the reverse? Hitchil b'tzarot, but if he starts with bilha, then yigmor af b'achayot. This is basically telling him, if you have this situation, the best way to do it is start with one of the tzarot. If you start with, for example, bilha, okay, you could have started with zilpa also. Then yigmor af b'achayot. Then he could finish with a sister. Why? Because mutar adam bikrovat tzarat chalutzato. Again, here the tzara is the opposite because the tzara is talking about the other wife, right? So bilhaz is chalutza. Then he can marry bilhaz tzara is Rachel, right? She's the tzara of the chalutza, right? It gets flipped. Who's the tzara here? And he's permitted to Rachel's relative. Because when you start with relatives, you have more of a problem. When you start with the tzara, who's not the relative, there's no problem to do the relative of your chalutza. Okay? This tzara and the relative of the chalutza, right, is all a matter of, it's an extension of achot chalutzato. If achot chalutzato is a problem, then your tzara of achot chalutzato is a problem. But here, you started with a non-sister. So it was really no problem. That's what it means. Chalatz litzarot nifteru achayot. Okay, it means if you start with a tzara, you can finish with a sister, and that will be totally fine. So we now have explained Shmuel in a very different way than we thought. Okay, then we're going to say Rav Ashi Amar la'olam k'dikamarta. No. I don't like this second explanation you gave of Shmuel. I'm going back to the first explanation. I'm going to explain it properly. When it says chalatz la'achayot lo nifteru tzarot, but litzarot nifteru achayot, it's what we saw before. Okay, that you do chalitza to both sisters, and that's weaker, right? It's not going to exempt the tzarot. And if you do it to the tzarot, it's strong, it will. And now how's he going to explain it? Because we had a problem with it. So he's going to say, Umishum de lo alima zika l'shavuya l'tzara ke'erva. Remember we tried to explain that Shmuel just holds ein zika, and then we had to try to come up with, well, then what's the issue with the tzarot, right? So now, or it shouldn't really work either. But now we're going to say, no. What was your whole problem? Your whole problem was if the achot have zika, then the tzarot have zika also, because the tzara is just like the other wife. Remember, they get all the laws. That's what we've been saying until now. The tzara is treated like the sister herself. So she's the tzara of a woman who can't do yibum. So her chalitza should be weak as well. And that's where we were stuck in the beginning. So what does he say? Lo alima zika. He does, Shmuel is zika. It holds like his opinion. But zika is not strong enough to make the tzara like an erva. Zika is only a derabbanan halacha. Okay, when we were talking about erva d'oraita, the tzara got the exact same definition of the first wife. But here we're talking about zika, which is already derabbanan. It's you're connected even though you haven't yet done yibum. That's derabbanan. We're not going to make the tzara. The zika is not strong enough to forbid the tzara, and that's why the tzarot aren't considered tzarot of achot kukato, of the sister who has zika. So that's how we resolve that issue. Okay, so that's a different explanation. Goes back to the original. It's the same structure as before, where we started with Shmuel. We said that doesn't make any sense, and then we explained Shmuel differently, and then we came back to the first explanation. Now we're doing the same thing with this case that we brought up in the middle of that discussion about this chalatz letzarot and chalatz lachayot. Now we're going to bring a braita that supports Rav Ashi's reading. Tanya kavatei to Rav Ashi, and then we're going to say, well, maybe it doesn't really. Chalatz lachayot lo nifteru tzarot. Oh, this is exactly what Shmuel said. Except that Shmuel said more than that, right? The braita ends with chalatz lachayot lo nifteru tzarot, just the first line. He doesn't continue with the tzarot, right? Nifteru achayot. But the Gemara says, it sounds like tzarot nifteru, halit tzarot nifteru achayot. You can infer from the braita exactly Shmuel's halacha, because it said, only achayot, the tzarot don't get exempt. But if you did the tzarot, that would be a good chalitza that would exempt everyone, which would then be the interpretation we just gave. So they say, my time, lav mishum de kasavar yesh zika. And what would be the logic of that inference? Because there must be zika, v'lo alima zika l'shavui l'tzara ke'erva. That must be the difference. To which Amar of Abba Bar Mama, you can't prove anything from that braita. Why? Interesting answer. Hamane Beit Shammai. Maybe that braita is Beit Shammai. Remember, Beit Shammai says tzarot There's no such thing as tzarot. Remember? The tzarot aren't like the erva. So likewise in Zika, they're not. Just because there is no such thing as tzarot, don't get. Remember that whole first Mishnah we learned all about the tzarot, and then all of a sudden we were told, oh, Beit Shammai doesn't hold by this at all. So maybe that braita that says it's a difference whether it's the sisters or the achayot, because you don't know about tzarot. Maybe it's Beit Shammai. So the Gemara says, wait, if that's the case, well, then they should be allowed to do yibum. If you hit the tzarot, don't only need to do chalitza, right? It shouldn't be chalatz l'chayot lo niftu tzarot, but the inference was chalatz l'tzarot. He could even do yibum for the tzarot, according to Beit Shammai. So they say, oh no, why not yibum? Because Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, remember Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri who said, bo v'nitaken lahem l'tzarot shu chotzot v'lo mit yavmot. Remember, he said in order to make a compromise between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel says the tzarot are exempt, they don't need anything. Beit Shammai says the tzarot can even do yibum. So let's find a middle ground, and let's say they do chalitza. And that's why this case is all about chalitza, right? This line, even according to Beit Shammai, because maybe he holds like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that it's Beit Shammai, but plus the takana of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that let's compromise a little bit and make them do chalitza. But remember this takana, we never implemented this takana, so why would you have a braita according to a takana that never got implemented, which is what the Gemara is going to ask. Remember this? Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri suggested, let's make this compromise. But in the end, they ran out of time, right? Some terrible tragedy happened. We don't know exactly. Something happened. They got distracted. They never went back to it, and they never instituted this. How could you possibly say this braita is according to what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri suggested? And then again, then it would be Beit Shammai, and then according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's suggestion, and it would have no bearing on our case because we're talking according to Beit Hillel. So, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak acharav chazru v'tiknu. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak suggests maybe they instituted this later, okay? In which case you could say that it was Beit Shammai, and in other words, this source doesn't really prove anything because you could say it's Beit Shammai, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's takana. Oh, you say they didn't do anything? Well, maybe they did. Now, this is a little bit strange because it seemed pretty clear that they never instituted this takana of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, but this is a good example of in order to answer up something, right, they bring all possible suggestions, even if they're not necessarily so realistic. Okay, so again, what did we do so far? Just to review, because I know it's a complicated daf. So we started with Rav and Shmuel and this machloket about three sisters who fall to Yevamot to two brothers, and what did they do, particularly with the third, or maybe even with all of them, depending on how you understand Shmuel. In order to question Shmuel, we brought this case of chalatz l'chayot lo niftu tzarot. We struggled with, is it because there is Zika, or is it because there isn't Zika, right? There were two ways to read it. Either you hold there's no Zika, or you hold there is Zika, and then you have to explain what this means. So if you hold this because there's no Zika, you have to explain it a little bit differently, that it doesn't mean you did chalitza to the two sisters or you did chalitza to the two tzarot. It means you started with the sisters and then you did one sister, one tzara. That won't work because of all the relatives of, right? You can't do yibum with the relative of the one you did chalitza to, her sister, sorry, not the relative, the tzara of the one you did chalitza to, her sister, right? Basically Leah, Rachel's tzara. But if you did the tzara first, then you could finish with the sisters. That was the kind of the second explanation, but because we've rejected the first, then we went back to the first and says, no. It's really because there is Zika, and it has to do with Zika. And what about the tzara? Why don't we treat the tzara the same way we treated the original one? That's because the tzara of a chutz kukato is not like a tzara of an erva, because chutz kukato is only derabanan, so we don't put her tzara in the same category as she is in terms of this rabbinic issue. Okay, those are our two ways of looking at Shmuel. Now we're going to get off on other questions that have to do, or another one question that has to do with chalitza psula. Moving on to Amud Bet now. Ba'alat haget u'ba'alat ma'amal. If you have someone who, now here, okay, let's go to our charts. You have someone, Shimon, okay, you have Reuven and Shimon, and Shimon's married to Yael and Shula, and Shimon dies, and Reuven does ma'amal with Shula and gives a get to Yael. So now the question is, which chalitza is going to be a stronger chalitza? Each is weak. Remember, we already discussed that. So ba'alat haget adifa mishum da'atcha ba b'chalitza. Should he do it better to the ba'alat haget because he already did chalitza? In other words, meaning he already started disconnecting from her, so maybe better that. Or dilma ba'alat ma'amar adifa mishum dekrova l'biyah. She was more close to doing yibum with him, so maybe better do yibum chalitza on her. So Amar Rav Ashi tashma. Let's learn it from here. Modeh Rabban Gamliel sheyesh get achar ma'amar u'ma'amar achar get. Okay, this is a totally different thing. This is what if he gives a get to one wife and then he gives a get to the second Yevamah, right? He gives a get to one and then a get to another. So if you give a get to a Yevamah, remember, it doesn't really have validity, but it does to the extent that she's considered a grusha, and she also still needs chalitza, but she has laws of as if a woman had a get. And likewise, ma'amal has as if she was married, even though she wasn't fully married. So it says, so get a hard get, but if he gives a get to the second Yevamah, that's useless because he already gave a get to the first one. It's useless to give one to the second because he's really already disconnected. And likewise, if he does ma'amar with the second one, after he did ma'amar with the first, he already did kiddushin with that one. That one's a forbidden marriage already. So if someone were to do ma'amar, achar ma'amar, or get a hard get, the second one is irrelevant. But Rabban Gamliel agrees that if there's get after ma'amar, he gives a ma'amar to one and then a get to the other, or the reverse, ma'amar, achar, get, he gives a get to one and then a ma'amal, it's actually a valid get and it's a valid ma'amal. So, I get adif lo lahane ma'amar batre, ma'amar adif lo lahane get batre. Each one, if one was stronger than the other, or less strong in terms of the connection, then there would be a difference between, right? You would say, oh, this is stronger than that one's stronger than that one. This shows that they're clearly both equal. Which means if you have one who gave a get to and one you give a mamar to, it's not like one chalitza is going to be stronger than the other. This is our last topic for today. We're going to have a machloket Rav and Rabbi Yochanan about the following case. Okay, we have three brothers, two sisters. Okay, now Reuven marries Rachel, Shimon marries Leah. We're left with Levi. So Reuven dies. Okay, it's going to have to be in order. Reuven dies first, which means right now, can Rachel marry Levi? Yes, no problem. He only has zika of one woman on him. Okay, as you see in the presentation. But when Shimon dies, let's say Levi hasn't done anything with Rachel yet. Shimon dies. Now Leah is connected to Levi as well. Levi has a zika of two sisters. He can't do yibum with either one of them. So now remember, he has to do chalitza. So chalatz l'rishona, if he does chalitza to Rachel, she can now go marry anyone she wants. Hutra. Chalatz l'shniya, if he does chalitza to the second one, to Leah, then hutra, right? In other words, basically, he has to do chalitza to each one, and then they can be permitted to everyone. But what if meita rishona? What if the one who fell to yibum first, Rachel, dies after Shimon died? Okay, in other words, first Reuven died, then Shimon died, then Rachel dies. So after there's already, remember, when Leah fell to yibum to Levi, she couldn't do yibum because Levi was connected to Rachel. But now that Rachel died, Levi's only connected to Leah. So comes Rav and he says, if Rachel dies, Levi is allowed to marry Leah. And likewise, right, which is even more obvious, and of course, if Leah dies, okay, then of course he can marry Rachel. Now, why is that? And of course, because remember, when Rachel, right, let's read it inside, says the following. Mishum dehavya yevamah shehutra v'nesra v'chazra v'utra tachzor letera rishon. Rachel was permitted in the beginning. Then when Shimon died, she became forbidden because Levi had zika of two wives on him. So therefore, Rachel, when Leah dies, Rachel goes back to being permitted. But the chiddush of Rav is even Leah can be permitted, even though when Leah fell to yibum to Levi, she couldn't marry him because he already had zika of her sister. Rabbi Yochanan is going to disagree on that point. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, meita shniya mutar b'rishona. Okay, if Leah dies, then Rachel is going to be permitted because she was permitted in the first place. But aval meita rishona, but if first, right, Reuven dies, Shimon dies, right, Leah falls to yibum, she can't marry Levi, then Rachel dies, Leah is still going to be prohibited to Levi because she was never permitted to him. Okay, that's Rabbi Yochanan. So now comes the Gemara and questions Rav and says, so first we're going to say, what's the reason for Rabbi Yochanan? My timer. Shekol yivama she'ein ani koreba b'shan nefila. At the time that she falls to Yibum, I can't say yivama yavo aleha. He can have relations with her because he couldn't, because he had Zika, the other sister. It's like a regular case where your brother dies, where your husband dies, he has children, and you're never permitted to the brother. There's no way she could be permitted. So they question Rav, lately, high spara, what, he doesn't hold this way? Rav says this explicitly. Why did Rav allow Leah? When it says explicitly, Rav says that line explicitly, the same one that Rabbi Yochanan said. So how could he possibly permit it? So they say, that's when she can't marry him because let's say he's married to her sister. And that's an Isur D'Oraita. Again, we're going to distinguish. We did this before today. Zika is only D'Rabbanan. Aval hacha Zika D'Rabbanan. This is only rabbinic. Therefore, it's okay. Going to end with this last question now on Rabbi Yochanan. Last chart for today. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina now questions. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Yochanan. He says, wait, Arba Achim. Remember our Mishnah on yesterday's stuff that we saw already like 4 times in this Masechet? Shnayim mehem nisuim shtei achayot, umetu anisuim et achayot. 4 brothers married to 2 sisters. The 2 brothers die. Then hare elu chotzot v'lo mityavot. What happens? Remember, they have zika of 2 women on them, and they have to do chalitza, both women. V'amai, if you say that the first one can go back to her original, right, and you say even the second one, right, either one is okay. Lechu chaminayu lachloch v'l'shniya. V'tavi rishona l'gabei idach kivama she'utra v'nesra v'chazra v'utra tachzor lehetera harishon. Why? You should just allow chalitza, right? Then if you let the second one do chalitza, the first one will be basically a yevamah that was permitted and then went back to her original. So why don't you allow that? Okay, we're going to stop here with that question and we'll pick up from this tomorrow. Okay, quite a complicated daf, but I hope that it was clear. And as I said, I'll fix up that chart and it'll be up later. Have a great day, everyone.